Nandan Singh, a medical Indian student in Ukraine. He's completed his 4th year and is trying desperately to make his way back. He's crossed into Romania, so he is extremely relieved. He's been trying since 4 days to do that. Let me go across to the rest of our panel tonight on the show. Ambassador Leela K Ponappa with us today. Jayant Dasgupta, former ambassador to the WTO, joining us. Nandan Unnikrishnan, distinguished fellow at ORF, today with us on the show. You know, we're going to try and get a sense of really where next with this. Nandan, let me begin by getting your take. We know that these talks have begun. Do you have any real optimism about a solution, a resolution coming out of these talks?
I think it's difficult to talk of a solution right now. But as you had mentioned earlier, introducing the subject, it is a good thing that they have started talking. I am not certain it will even necessarily lead to a de-escalation. But let's hope that they manage to arrive at some kind of confidence-building measures, at least, even if they don't arrive at a full understanding and agreement right away. But unfortunately, I'm not imbued with confidence because the composition of both the delegations, although it must be presumptuous on my part to say this, appears a little weak.
Okay. I'll come back to you to expand on that. Is this a serious talk or is this just for the world to show? But I also want to come to Ambassador Ponappa on what we have seen in the last couple of days. I mean, it was being expected when this war broke out 5 days ago that Russia would pretty much just waltz in. That hasn't happened. It isn't as if Ukraine has surrendered. And while the initial sanctions were being called tepid, they have now really been ramped up with, you know, Russia being excluded from SWIFT, etc. Do you think this is enough to get Putin to back down? And what is the face saver he'll need to find to be able to back down?
I think your question is loaded with a lot of assumptions, and the terms used are a 0-1 situation. Whereas Putin, I'm sure, has made his calculations and has strategized his movements in terms of the objectives he hopes to achieve. There is always the risk amidst the fog of war of accidents happening, of hot-headed people going beyond what the stated military objective is. But as of now, on the one hand, you have the operations going on and with Russian troops surrounding Kiev, Kharkiv has fallen and so on. On the other hand, you have these talks. Are they necessarily contradictory? Not really. And I would suggest we think back to what happened during Kargil, when the hostilities were still going on. And yet Pakistan sent a special envoy to try to seek peace. So these are not things that one can sort of make a rational prediction about, but one has to just take it step by step in terms of what is happening. I'm sure there are some very tough talks going on. I personally see the talks currently taking place as a kind of sounding board to see where there is room for negotiation on either side, and whether there could be some meeting ground, at least for cessation of hostilities, even if not for a longer term peace. So it's an evolving situation. We cannot be in the business of trying to, speculate about definite outcomes. It is part of a process.
Sure. Ambassador Dasgupta, you know, from what we've seen, it seems most of the Western world has bandied behind Ukraine very strongly. They're sending in weapons, they're sending in money, they're imposing even stricter sanctions. Do you think this is enough for Russia to back down?
I think there are two aspects to this. For one, if President Zelenskyy had left the country, that would have given a signal to his troops, and they could have been slightly demoralized. But his standing firm and saying that I don't want a ride, I want support from the rest of the world. And then many of his parliamentarians also coming on social media and with guns and with their statements saying that we will stay back and defend the country. So this is the kind of thing which has, I think, also bolstered the will of the people to resist Russian advances. So this perhaps, of course, President Putin would have factored in many things, but the advance which was made in the first 24 hours, I think, has slowed down quite a bit in the last 48 hours or so. So that is one thing which may not have been fully factored in. So that is one issue. The second point is that sanctions, when they were imposed by the US, for instance, or the UK, they were fairly mild in nature, to put it rather diplomatically. But then from, once the Russians started advancing, I think the sanctions became much harsher. And today the Central Bank of Russia has been prevented from, holding up the ruble, and the ruble has fallen by about 30%. Now, there is going to be a lot of pressure on the Russian economy, and inflation is, if it goes on for some time, inflation is bound to rise in Russia. And there will be ripple effects elsewhere in the world, including in the West, and of course, India and other countries. So I think this may have again been factored in by President Putin, that there could be harsh sanctions after 4 or 5 days. So whatever he had to gain in terms of showing his might, in terms of showing his will, he had to do it within these 3 or 4 days. If he could capture Kiev, well and good. If not, at least he could have Kiev surrounded by his troops, and then that would put additional pressure on the Ukrainian government. So he has succeeded on this front. Now, the Ukrainians, had offered after, I think, 2 days or so to talk to the Russians, and the Russians had declined. Now they have accepted, and today the talks have started. So again, it means a slight thaw in the frigid kind of relationship between the two countries over the past 5 days. So this is the beginning. One doesn't know where it will end, but there is enough pressure on the Russians. And the third point I wanted to mention is the steady supply of arms, which you have also mentioned, to neighboring countries, which will be finding their way into the hands of the Ukrainian army as well as the civilian population. There are a large number of reservists also in Ukraine. So that would only stiffen the resistance against the Russian forces, especially in the urban areas, where it may not be very easy to roll across whole townships and cities and gain control. So all these factors, I think, are there. So we are. So
you talk about reservists. You talk about reservists, Ambassador Dasgupta. I think people will look back and see how this resistance was also met by bringing in reservists, calling on whoever wants to join in to the quote-unquote mission, saying we will release prisoners if they're willing to fight. So all of that have been done. I just wanted to update all of you and our viewers, Wire report that has just come out, where Ukraine solution possible only if Russia's security interests are considered, Russian President Putin tells French President Emmanuel Macron. This is attributed to Sputnik, their agency, their news agency. There is also another wire line, a ticker line, which says that President Putin has no assets abroad. That's Kremlin on personal sanctions by Western nations. So they're saying two things. They're basically saying that, we don't care about your sanctions. It doesn't harm Putin. And he is saying that we really want something to take away from this negotiation. Mr. Unnikrishnan, what is that something that will be taken away? Because the positions are quite polarized. Today, before going into the meeting, Zelenskyy says and tells the EU that if you really want to stand by me, now include me in the club. which is what is anathema to Putin. Where is the middle path here, which gives room for negotiation?
I don't think EU membership is the issue. And I don't think that was ever mentioned in any of the demands that the Russians had put forth. The first and foremost demand of the Russians is that Ukraine and Georgia and Belarus be clearly designated as neutral zones by the West, where NATO shall not expand and shall not place any offensive weaponry. That was demand number one. Essentially, of course, the original demand, as it was put in December, was clearly unacceptable because Putin was demanding that all this be put down as a treaty, a signed document and all that. But that was a negotiation opener. And obviously there was much to talk about. If you notice, it is Zelenskyy, as Ambassador Dasgupta pointed out, who said now, after 3 days of war, that I'm willing to discuss neutrality. And it is then that the Russians came back and said, okay, we are ready to talk to you. So if this whole issue of neutrality had been given to the Russians in the first or the second meeting of the Normandy session, which took place in Paris and Berlin, none of this would have happened. In fact, the entire buildup may not have happened to the extent that it is. The second thing is about sanctions. I agree with you. There is going to be a lot of pain on Russia, but also look at the sanctions very carefully. I mean, there is the dramatic thing of Putin and all being sanctioned, but please note in SWIFT, very clear exemption to all Russian energy exports, right? So the West wants a lot of noise and fireworks, but doesn't want to hurt itself. The United States and its allies in the last 48 hours have increased their purchases of oil from Russia up to $400 million. So, you know, there is a lot of mirror and smoke going on in this thing. Third, this issue of Russians getting bogged down. I think when military tactics are discussed, you have to keep in mind certain things. The Ukrainians, and I think it's very smart on the part of the Ukrainians, what they have done is they have put their military assets, their artillery guns, their rocket launchers in civilian quarters. They've put them in courtyards of buildings. Their rocket launchers are on top of residential blocks. The Russians are reluctant at this stage of the war to go in for total decimation. So they are holding back at a point. In places like Kharkiv, people have come out on the street. So the Russian tank columns have actually, in some places like Chernigorov and all, they have turned back because they are not fighting. Right now, they're trying to not fight or cause any civilian casualties. How long will that sort of restraint last? I am not very sure, because you yourself said Putin needs a win somewhere down the line. How long is he going to go without a win? So at that point, why there is no advance in the Donetsk area? Well, you know, for 8 years, Ukraine has been building defenses there. And they are very, very powerful. And in the southern part, the Russian army is not fighting. It is the volunteer forces of the rebel republics. So it is going to take some time. So overall, I would say that it's early days. The next 48 hours in terms of military field are critical. But I would imagine that the Russians have miscalculated, definitely, and I agree with Ambassador Dasgupta, that the will to fight was unexpected. The Russians did not expect that the people would come out in this kind of way to fight for what they perceive to be a corrupt regime. But at the end of the day, I think the Russians are also cold-blooded calculators of why they went in, and they will then resort. Right now, they're using only about 30 to 40% of that entire force that they had accumulated on the borders of Ukraine. Now, I think they will resort to all that full force if they feel that they are not making any progress in the next 48 hours. But I think that the Russians would be looking, originally also, would have been looking at winding up everything in 3 to 4 weeks, particularly because the Russians are really not looking at occupation of Ukraine. They probably are looking at
Right.
regime change and getting out. So having said that, I do
So
not think they have chosen the right way, but that's a different matter.
no, actually, that is the big question right now. That even if there are people who believe that the Russians are very justified in protecting their borders and stopping the advancement of NATO, was invading Ukraine the right way? Ambassador Ponappa, I want to come to you on the question of India's position and stance. And we have talked about this before, but it merits reiteration, I believe, because of the huge support in the media worldwide, or at least I would say the Western media, that Ukraine is receiving. The general perception is that the Ukrainians are victims who are standing up to a big bully Russia, and the world has come together behind Ukraine to support them. And in this picture, India is still silent. How long can we continue doing that?
First of all, India is not silent. I think that's a misnomer. And India's policies are guided not just by what the media says, but by India's own interests, number one. Number two, as Nandan rightly pointed out, the issue is NATO. And it was interesting that in the readout from the MEA on the Prime Minister's telephone call with President Putin, that he talked about Russia resolving its issues not with Ukraine, but with NATO. And that really is the crux of the matter. So if you read the statement made by our permanent representative in the explanation of vote at the Security Council, yes, it is a fact that India abstained. India chose not to take sides in the overt manner of condemnation, deploring, etc., etc. But there is commitment to territorial integrity. There's a request for cessation of hostilities, for respect for boundaries, and so on and so forth. It is a very finely tuned statement. Now, it couldn't have been easy, and I'm sure that many people in MEA and at the PMI in New York burnt midnight oil in trying to develop this statement. The fact of the matter is we have close relations with the United States and with Europe, as well as with Russia. Where do you find the balance in terms of protecting India's interests? The issue is not what the media says. And I go back to situations where, for example, India is advised to talk to one military regime, say in Pakistan, but not talk to another military regime, say in Myanmar, right? Whereas I think when you're good friends, you might not say everything in public, and I can assure you that private diplomatic conversation can often be much more precise and blunt than is publicly stated. And this is what Ambassador Dasgupta talked about, being diplomatic about it. This is really for consumption by the media, if I may say so. What is said privately, and you got a hint of it in the statement on the Prime Minister's phone call with Putin, it tells you a different story. Now,
right.
Your position does not have to be in the same style or manner as, for example, the West. Yes, there's a lot of noise about it. There was a lot of noise before it happened. But actually, what has happened? We are not talking here really just about NATO. We are talking about European security post the collapse of the Soviet Union, and before that, post the end of the Cold War. There were expectations at that time also that NATO would be wound up and so on and so forth. So the issue is very much larger. And within that framework, within the context of India's interests and the students who wish to come back, and apparently not all of them wish to come back,
right.
I think India has taken the path that it believes would work best for it. Privately, what is said to friends is a different matter. And when you have good friends, you can afford to talk frankly. I am pretty sure that has happened.
Okay. Okay, so it's an interesting and nuanced discussion, because this has become a day and age where public positions taken by everyone, even if it's nations, tend to matter. That's how they're consumed very quickly by the world at large, more than readouts which, you know, are brought in. I'm so sorry, Ambassador Ponappa, I have to end. I'm completely running out of time. I'll take a very short break. But when